But when COVID started, I was initially concerned, like everyone was. We didn't know what it was. We didn't know the illness. But I became suspicious when the health authorities started an overt campaign against hydroxychloroquine, which I knew was a safe drug because I'm from the industry. I had familiarity with it. Looked specifically into the issue that they were falsely assigning to it, which is QT prolongation and arrhythmias associated with drug-induced QT prolongation. It happened to be the area of focus of the company, the last company that I had and worked in pharma. And I knew that what they were saying about this drug was absolutely not true. And more importantly, the regulators knew perfectly well that they were saying things that were not true. So that gave me a pause immediately. And I started thinking, well, I mean, they're professionals. They know this issue. They know this data. Yet they're saying things that are not true. And that led me to start questioning the whole thing. You know, if you catch an official, a professional lying about something, you know, straight to the public, what else are they lying about? And so that kind of started my whole investigation into it. And also I was familiar with a little bit familiar, not very deeply, but I did come across this mRNA class in the past in my professional work when these products were in development for other different things, very severe conditions such as cancer, for example. And I knew that these products were inherently dangerous, which is not unusual in the pharmaceutical research and development. We frequently work on things that are, you know, they're risky, that can be toxic, such as chemo agents, for example. They're toxic. But, you know, there is application for all sorts of things, and you know, the risk-benefit profile is always a consideration. And so I knew that these products were inherently dangerous, inherently toxic. They were developed as a cancer products in the past. Yet all of a sudden our regulators were all gung-ho about, oh, these are going to be prophylactic vaccines. They're going to be given to children, pregnant women, everyone, regardless of their health status, age, or risk profile with regard to COVID. So that gave me yet another pause. And so I just became extremely suspicious about this whole situation, and that's how I started looking into it. And I also went to work for pharmaceutical industry right from the start. I worked in various capacities and eventually started my own several businesses I co-founded. And they were all successful. And the last one, as I said, was actually focused on cardiovascular safety testing in pharmaceutical research and development, looking at electrocardiograms, looking at QT prolongation, you know, the issue that they were assigning to hydroxychloroquine falsely.
So you were involved deeply in clinical trials. Mm-hmm. That's what I want to establish.
Yes.
From many different angles, or?
Right. So the last one was cardiovascular safety testing in humans. Previous ones dealt with oncology, imaging studies, arthritis. I actually worked in all therapeutic areas. My clients were a variety of pharma companies, large ones and small ones. Pfizer included. Pfizer was also our research and development partner. So we were developing technologies that they were interested in applying in their clinical trial space to make it, you know, more precise data collection, more accurate, more reliable. So partnered with Pfizer several times, worked with large companies, GSK, Novartis, AstraZeneca, Johnson, and a variety of small, we call them biotechs. So I was very familiar with the space.
And then what about this manufacturing side of things? Mm-hmm. You know, for most of us, this is kind of a black box, right? You just assume it's done and it's done right.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. So that's a very big issue that people often don't appreciate. The whole FDA regulation actually it hinges on the good manufacturing practice regulation. So all they're regulating is the compliance of the manufacturers with essentially what manufacturer claims about their product, and what they claim on the label. It needs to be true. And needs to be reproducible in every pill, every bottle, every vial, everything that the manufacturer ships. So in the United States and worldwide, and especially in developed countries, we have laws that are similar. In the United States, it's called good manufacturing practices. It's extensive set of laws. It governs everything: the raw materials, the impurities, the potency, the contaminants. You know, so it's an extremely complicated structure that every participant of this industry has to comply with parts of or entirely. If you are selling a drug in the United States, then you're responsible for your own compliance with all of it, including all your vendors' compliance with all of it. So it's so I had to comply with parts of this as a business owner of a contractor that was performing work for Pfizer, and we knew how difficult, how extensive, how tight everything is regulated. That's what people don't really understand. It's majority of the entire industry is engaged in some ways in compliance with these rules, and so that's extremely important to know, and it's extremely important to follow. You have to prove that the product has certain ingredients and certain quantities, and again, as I said, they're present in every single dose of the product. So that's why I was always focused on this, because I knew how important it is.
So you started digging around, you noticed that things weren't quite maybe what they seem. So where did you start looking? Where did you start finding problems? Yeah, so
in addition to looking at what was happening with hydroxychloroquine, I became suspicious once the mRNA products started coming on the market. Obviously, there was a lot of reports of adverse events and deaths, which I was expecting. As I said, I knew this product was inherently dangerous, and I knew it's just going to be a lot of problems. And there's VAERS database. CDC maintains VAERS database, and there are some others in the UK. There's Yellow Card and Vigilance in Europe, and all kinds of other databases. They all started showing huge numbers of adverse events and deaths right away, and the government was denying that those were associated, denying that they're happening, and they continue denying to this day.
So I briefly want to discuss VAERS, because I had never heard of this until basically this pandemic. And the way we were taught about VAERS, I mean, the general public, right, early on, was that this was some kind of poor system that shouldn't really be trusted because it's just self-reporting. I mean, roughly, I remember learning about that, and then kind of being shocked to learn that that's not how it was considered in the past. No. So maybe just tell me about that.
Yeah. So this is very interesting, because depending on when you ask CDC officials about VAERS, it's either an amazing bulletproof system that is so reliable, and they always maintains this wonderful data set for them to monitor safety, or it's completely poor and unreliable, and usually the reports are made up. It just depends on how they want to answer the question, right? So, but historically, before COVID and before it got so contentious, historically it was considered a fairly reliable database, and it's actually a very important database. And while they're saying, well, it's not definitive if a report shows up for something that it was caused by this product, but even on their website it says it's an important early warning system to identify unusual data patterns, and that's how I was using it. I was using it exactly for that purpose. I wanted to look at the data pattern that was coming across. The first immediate finding was that the total volume of adverse events and deaths was, 10 times and more higher than all the previous vaccine products combined. And the database is very old. It's I think it started in the 90s, and it has reports for about 90 or so, maybe close to 100 different vaccine products from hundreds of manufacturers. So you have a very rich data set, and you see that historically it's here, and then 2021 comes across and it's this. So of course it's a signal. It's undeniable. There's a signal. It's a pattern. It needs to be investigated, but no investigation ever happened.
Well, we heard that they can't find a signal. I've interviewed a number of people who have spoken directly with the FDA and IHS over the thing. We're just not seeing any signal here.
So that was a signal for me, them not seeing the signal, because if you have government officials staring at a very loud signal and telling you there is no signal, that's a signal in itself. And that was a big question. To me, that was, for a long time, I could not understand how they were able to do this, how they were able to deny the reality with a straight face, and nothing would happen, and nobody would be in trouble or investigated or prosecuted, while we have this very loud and clear signal of huge injury and deaths occurring to the Americans, including pregnant women, including children. So that was a big problem. And big question for me. I couldn't answer it, but now I can.
And so what did you decide to do?
So I wanted to investigate data for myself first, and I wanted to look specifically because I have experience in pharma manufacturing and good manufacturing practice compliance. I looked at the data, not just at the total number of adverse events and deaths, but also how the pattern of the data across manufacturing lots or batches. So all pharmaceutical products are manufactured in lots or batches. The lots are numbered. You can look at, if you go to the pharmacy and buy Advil, you can look on the box. It has a lot number. So those are the lot numbers that can be recorded in VAERS reports when people submit the reports. And they're not always there because people who are submitting the reports, which is either patients, their relatives, pharmacists or doctors, healthcare professionals or nurses, they don't always have that information. So you may not remember what was the batch number you were injected with. You don't have your card with you, or the physician doesn't know. So, but in about 50% of the reports, those numbers are there. And so I was able to match those lot numbers with CDC lot numbers. I have a list of them. And I was able to see that not only the adverse events were high, but the variability of them by batch was extreme, absolutely extreme.
Explain that to me, the variability among them. Yeah.
So the variability meaning how many total reports are submitted for a particular batch number. So some batch numbers had 2 or 3 reports, and some had 5,000, 6,000. That should never happen. You should never. If you think about it, if you're buying, Advil today, your experience, if you're buying it today and you're buying it a month from now, your experience a month from now shouldn't be 1,000% different, because that's really dangerous. Even if you think Advil is safe medication or aspirin is safe medication, or even if you're buying orange juice, and your experience today and the week from now 1,000 times or 1,000% different, that's going to be very dangerous. One of those instances is very dangerous. So when you see a variability like this between batches of what is supposed to be consistently produced, good manufacturing practice compliant product, it means the product is not good manufacturing practice compliant. And I, as a comparator, because I didn't have a baseline for this and I didn't have information, for example, of the batch sizes at the time, I do now, and the story doesn't change. But at the time I didn't, so I thought I should compare it to something known, and something known was flu vaccines. So I extracted all the data for flu vaccines from VAERS, and I looked how flu vaccine data looks batch to batch over a long period of time. And by the way, it's much more much more variety of producers making different sizes of batches. There are dozens of manufacturers of flu vaccines historically, and different sizes of batches. And for flu vaccines, it looks as expected for good manufacturing practice compliant product, which is straight line, very close to zero. All the batches line up, and just very, very little variability, just a tiny bit. And then when you compare them to these COVID shots, you can't even put them on the same graph. Flu vaccine data disappears because the COVID shots variability is huge, absolutely huge, enormous. So I knew at that time, which was toward middle 2021, toward fall of 2021, I knew for sure they were not good manufacturing practice compliant. So we have not good manufacturing practice compliant product being produced, shipped in millions of doses, and injected in millions of people, including pregnant women and children. We have CDC and FDA lying and saying there is no signal at all, and this continues for a long time. And then eventually, I ran across research by my now collaborator, Catherine Watt. She's done an incredible legal analysis of how the government and the healthcare agencies, what set of laws they're utilizing to enable this, to enable to subvert the good manufacturing practice compliance laws and be able to continue denying that there is any injury or any death or any problem occurring with these products for a long time. And this continues to date. What we found is the whole representation of what is happening is a lie. It's basically the U.S. government is representing to the public that this is a health event and the response to a health event. But in fact, what they are doing is this is a military operation. These so-called vaccines, they're not really vaccines, but these injections are being manufactured under defense contracts, utilizing Defense Production Act, other transaction authority, and emergency use authorization under public health emergency. So when these things are used together, then good manufacturing practices do not apply to these products at all.
Even legally?
Even legally, yeah.
Right.
So there's this law on the books, 21 USC 360 BBB that says emergency use authorized countermeasures under public health emergency cannot constitute clinical investigation. So clinical investigation is actually not possible for these countermeasures. And if clinical investigation is not possible, then you cannot have clinical trials, you cannot have informed consent, you cannot have clinical trial subjects or clinical trial investigators. So utilizing the structure of emergency use authorization, public health emergency, other transaction authority, Defense Production Act, the government was able to commandeer pharmaceutical companies to produce these non-compliant injectable products and distribute them, calling them a medicine, where in fact it's not a medicine. It's an act of war. They're using Defense Production Act, machinery, United States military. Even internationally, this is being distributed from this military to overseas militaries, not pharmaceutical distribution chain. So they're using the military machinery to distribute these non-compliant products, including biologicals, chemicals, all kinds of ingredients we don't really understand very well, and call it public health and medicine.
First of all, this sounds so fantastical, what you just said, right? What, really? That's crazy. Now, one thing I know for sure is not crazy, which is the fact that it's the military that did the distribution. That's official. That's actually that's public knowledge. That was announced. I know people who are responsible for the distribution, and they're very proud of doing the distribution because they felt it was the only, I guess, structure in society that's able to deploy something like this fast enough, right? And I have that on record. Now, but what about these other parts? Like that this is actually the U.S. government contracting these pharma companies to develop a countermeasure against what?
Well, so the countermeasure is a very important legal term. So, and I advise people to look it up. So the countermeasure, it's a very fuzzy term, first of all. So anything can be a countermeasure. A lock on the door is a countermeasure against a break-in. So calling something a countermeasure, you already remove the precision of the legal definitions of a pharmaceutical, for example. So, but we know already it's not a pharmaceutical. Also, what I'm saying, I'm not. It's not a conspiracy. Definitely not, because the law that I just described, this 21 USC 360 BBB, it's cited by everyone, including the FDA in their documents, including by the manufacturers in their documents, by GAO reports that discuss this. Recently, as you may know, Brooke Jackson's False Claims Act case was dismissed. The judge, you can read the dismissal of this case. The judge agrees with what I just said. He agreed with the fact that Pfizer wasn't supposed to be compliant with good manufacturing practices per contract with the Department of Defense, that they were producing countermeasures, that they were producing large-scale manufacturing demonstration, which is how these things were ordered from the government. He essentially describes this in more sophisticated 100-page document.
Based on a contract.
Based on the contract
right.
that Pfizer produced.
Right.
Pfizer produced their DoD contract, and since then, hundreds of Department of Defense contracts for COVID countermeasures were released through FOIA, although they're partially redacted. But I read a lot of them, and they're all online. I read the Pfizer, Moderna ones and some other vaccines, and they're all essentially similar. They're utilizing the structure of ordering countermeasures, ordering prototypes, Department of Defense ordering it, from the pharmaceutical manufacturers under Defense Production Act, under other transaction authority, and the good manufacturing practices are not part of it at all. So this product, by statute and by contract with Department of Defense, does not need to be compliant with good manufacturing practices.
We're going to be joined by Sasha Alexander Latypova, that we know and love as Sasha, and Dr. Merrill Ness. Sasha will begin with a presentation, Intent to Harm, Evidence of a Conspiracy to Commit Mass Murder by the U.S. DoD, HHS, and Pharma Criminal Enterprise. Let me describe her background. She has a remarkable combination of gifts. She is a very talented artist. She has deep scientific expert and experience as an entrepreneur and lots of business skills. She was a pharmaceutical industry executive for more than 30 years with extensive experience in the research and development of pharmaceutical products. As head of her own companies, she has focused on the creation and review of clinical trials. She knows everything there is to know about good manufacturing practice requirements for pharmaceutical products. Her research and presentations on the COVID-19 injections have been an invaluable resource for the Doctors for COVID Ethics and many other medical and scientific groups. Sasha?
Thank you, Catherine. Thank you for inviting me to speak today. I'm going to talk about my topic is intent to harm, and trying to describe, as far as I know at this point, the organizational structure and the money flow of the criminal enterprise that is behind what is being marketed to the public as COVID pandemic and pandemic response. So why at this point, people who don't see it, I really feel sorry for them. But people who do see it, everyone says, well, then why there's no action? Why we can't get any resolution from any regulatory body or the court? And I'm going to attempt to address it from the point of view of the US, but for the international audience, you can likely find the same structures within your country's legal systems. So for the US, there's been a pseudo legalization of mass murder. And basically, I'm borrowing here from research of a brilliant woman, Catherine Watt, and I highly recommend everyone to read her Substack, Bailiwick News, where this is researched and cited in detail, and a very useful resource for anyone who wants to prosecute this. In the US, we have three key pieces of this legal cage. First is the Emergency Use Authorization Law, which was put in place in 1997 under Clinton. This is more or less familiar to everyone, so I'm not going to spend much time on it. The second critical piece is so-called Other Transaction Authority. I'll spend a little bit of time on this. It was put in place a long time ago in the 60s, or started being used in the 60s, but most recently amended under Obama in 2015. And this piece of authority or law allows Department of Defense in particular to order military prototypes from various companies, including pharmaceutical companies. And the final keystone that clicks this whole structure into place is the PrEP Act and the public health emergency, which were also they were put in place previously, but they were significantly bulletproofed by Robert Godlek right before the COVID pandemic was announced in 2020. And so that was also covered previously by lawyers, but all of these three pieces together, they constitute the structure. And the public health emergency is extremely important for making sure that all of this stays in place. And that's why it's been extended, again, nonsensically over and over and over again. And my prediction, it will continue being extended. So let's look at the Other Transaction Authority. It started in the 1960s for NASA only, but now 11 government agencies use it. DoD is particularly fond of it, and they can order things like prototypes and countermeasures, and other is a catch-all. Other means it's not a contract, not a research grant, not a procurement, so not anything else which is regulated and accountable. So that's in terms of government contracting. So this allows them to buy these vaguely defined countermeasures from otherwise regulated entities, such as pharmaceutical companies, without following any regulations, such as good manufacturing practices, for example. So finally, use of these three things together, that's why it clicks it into place. The use of EUA-covered countermeasures does not constitute clinical investigation. This is a very critical piece of US code here cited. That's what it says. And in fact, FDA is fully aware of this because they cited this particular piece of law in their draft guidance, and now it's final guidance. So that in the final guidance, that citation was removed, but in the draft guidance, I saw this citation referring to this piece of law and draft guidance for the development of COVID-19 vaccines, which they published in 2020. Hastily, by the way, put together and with some typos and things, but it exists. So they are aware of this. They know that these products cannot be clinical investigational products. They're not subject to FDA regulation, therefore, and yet they go on and pretend that these are pharmaceuticals. Countermeasures are not pharmaceutical products. According to this, they are not subject to FDA regulation. And this is a very important piece of deception that FDA has practiced on everyone, I'm sure, on US citizens, but also global audience and global regulators probably, and governments, because they all follow the FDA, and FDA for years was considered the gold standard of regulatory practice. So how are these countermeasures deployed? Another very important point, I apologize for a lot of words here, but this is just basically copy-paste from the US code. What's important to understand that these countermeasures are deployed
on a sole authority of HHS secretary during the public health emergency. So he or she, the single person, decides whether these products, based on the totality of scientific evidence available, if available, so it doesn't have to be available, they decide whether they may be effective. That's the only standard. There's nothing else. They decide that they may be effective, and they are supposed to take into account known and potential risks and benefits for every single person in the United States. So the Health and Human Services Secretary under Trump was Alex Azar, and now it's Javier Becerra. So Javier Becerra is deciding for 300 million of us whether this particular product, for which there might not be any scientific evidence, and he doesn't have to take it into account, by the way, he can pretend that it doesn't exist, which he has been doing so far, that he can decide for every man, woman, child, regardless of their age, healthcare conditions, and any other circumstances of their life. So this is how this is all written into the US law. And there's no stopping criteria. They never have to revise this decision. That explains why there's such a massive suppression campaign of all the information and good data and refusal to look at the expert reports. So that just summarizes from the legal perspective. Vaccine development and approval is a performance art. It's a voluntary, by the way, performance art by pharmaceutical companies and the FDA. FDA has no legal authority over these products, and that's why the clinical trials were not really ordered by the Department of Defense. I will show in more detail how, and because they're not possible for countermeasures. And GMP was also not ordered because it's not possible. And the FDA is basically impersonating regulators all this time and lying to the public about it. And I also have evidence that somebody else took over the role of the regulator in the United States. Now, just to step back and say, what's the structure? Who decides? Let's figure out who is in the decision-making roles and other ceremonial and pretend roles. So in the United States, it's the National Security Council that's in charge of the COVID policy, not HHS, which is highly, highly unusual if we're talking about a healthcare event. So the National Security Council is the executive forum for the United States presidents, and it's attended regularly by, as you can see, largely defense and intelligence officers, high officers, and it's not attended by the health agency representatives. So that should give us a pause a little bit. Why are they doing this if they're calling this a healthcare emergency? And here's the organizational structure from a pandemic action plan, current version, which clearly dedicates the decisional role to the National Security Council. And FEMA here is a lead federal agency, also very strange because they do not deal with healthcare emergencies and they never had a plan for a pandemic response. Now, the FEMA was swiftly pushed into the lead federal agency role. And that happened because President Trump announced this healthcare emergency under the Stafford Act, which was also never used before. And this was the first time FEMA was serving in the role of a public health incident. And as I said, they had no plans, obviously no preparedness for this. And that's why that makes them a perfect figurehead ceremonial role. And the HHS is heavily involved in various functions, but they're clearly doing the information or disinformation or propaganda role because, as I said, they're pretending to do something that they have no authority of. This is straight from the org chart, straight from the presentation by, I believe, BARDA, and this was done at the Vaccines and Related Biologicals Advisory Committee meeting in October of 2020. And you can see the organizational structure of Operation Warp Speed. Ostensibly, it was marketed as a collaborative effort between HHS and Department of Defense. But clearly, you can see that according to their own organizational chart, the chief operating officer of this entire organization is the Department of Defense, and the HHS is the chief science advisor. And then we have a whole big layer of top executive functions in this organizational chart conducted by the US government, and specifically Department of Defense, BARDA, DOJ as well. And you can see that they're responsible for everything. So everything goes through the organization that's entirely government. and including the supply, production, distribution, manufacturing, including the legal cover, which explains why the Department of Justice lawyers were arguing on behalf of Pfizer and protecting their commercial interests when they were trying to hide the clinical trial data for 75 years. Obviously pharma is involved here, but they're third level down and they're not in charge, but they're getting a lot of money. So who's really developing these injections? It's according to their own slides, it's their own organization. So the Department of Defense is established on the right-hand side of the slide. You can see all these companies have been established for years, suppliers of the Department of Defense, producing these vaguely defined things for them, including vaccines. And on the right-hand side, they're showing their vaccine portfolio, but notice that all of them are saying manufacturing demonstration or large-scale manufacturing. That's exactly what was ordered from these companies by the other transaction authority contracts with Department of Defense demonstrations. So here it says demo and here it says manufacturing. So that's where the product is being manufactured and the money is flowing purely for demonstrations. And here we go again. BARDA was claiming that they also was very proud of being able to accelerate clinical development by breaking the law. Here we go. They're saying we're going to compress all these rigorous and boring and stages of development that require a lot of compliance by doing no compliance at all and by manufacturing large-scale commercial biological products before safety can be properly tested. Okay, so that's their innovation. Their innovation is that they're going to bypass Code of Federal Regulation. And here's who is claiming to perform regulatory functions in the US today. It's BARDA. BARDA in the public presentation were claiming that they have, also very proud and giddy about their accomplishments, that they have tested and for acceptance 600 million doses of COVID vaccines in the US and over 23 million doses of therapeutics. And that gave me and a bunch of my colleagues a pause. We said, well, which act of Congress transferred the regulatory authority over to BARDA? We don't know, but that's what they're claiming. They're also claiming that they are increasing industry and regulatory surveillance and good manufacturing practices. They're also claiming to do something about it, although we know that no real audits or inspections happened at these facilities.
Opportunity for me to brag a little bit. Before the U.S. government could purchase and release any of the COVID-19 product, the RQA quality team must perform a review and acceptance. In 2022, this team performed review of the quality manufacturing, of the quality manufacturing documentation and labeling for almost 600 million COVID-19 vaccine doses and over 23 million COVID-19 therapeutic doses. For the entire pandemic, they have accepted over 1.2 billion doses of COVID-19 vaccines. So I want you to think about that. Every COVID-19 vaccine that the American public has received was reviewed by our quality team. And they did this working around the clock, 7 days a week, with a turnaround time of 1 to 2 hours. And they've done this work for the last 2 years. And I was gonna say, I think they need a round of applause. I think they need another one, right?
And here's the money flow. So again, BARDA is super proud that they have deployed, and this is just on the R&D side of things, that they have deployed 47.5 billion to private commercial manufacturers and contractors, of which 33 billion went to the vaccine development. And as you can see, they're now supporting 97 products. For reference, the entire US pharmaceutical industry spends around $100 billion a year for R&D, meaning that BARDA alone took over the entire pharmaceutical industry in the United States. Here are all the contracts that were, in fact, personally then approved by Robert Kudlick. And this is where the $40 billion went. As you can see, this is a screenshot. You can see the link to the page where all of these contracts are available. And all of them are DoD, run through ATI, Advanced Technologies International. And then there are parallel contracts with BARDA. They cover all so-called COVID pandemic response measures, including vaccines here. This is ATI. This is the manager of the money. For the government, as you can see, it's very healthcare related with the machine gun. And they manage two consortia of private manufacturers that include these development of these biological substances. And all the money flows through them, and they're using this other transaction authority mechanism, which I circled on their screenshot.
I'm going to interrupt Sasha here for a second. I've skipped down to page 6 of the ATI contract that she was just referencing, which states this is the scope of the agreement. First of all, notice that the agreement is between the U.S. Army Contracting Command in New Jersey, and it's entering into a Section 815 prototype. Let those words sink in, because again, in most of these contracts, the words prototype, countermeasure, etc. is what's used to define the kind of product that the Army is ordering, okay? So this is a Section 815 prototype, other transaction agreement. Again, what this means is that because of an emergency, we're able to use the other transaction agreement, because normally if you are trying to win a bid with the Army, they have a number of rules, regulations, and laws which strictly prohibit going and giving the contract to one person or another. During war and during other emergencies, they can get rid of that bidding process that makes it be competitive. So that's what they're doing here. Because President Trump created a medical emergency in the United States, right? They are allowed then to use this other transaction agreement, an OTA. And it is with the medical CBRN Defense Consortium. Now, when I was a Marine, we called it Nuclear, Biological, and Chemical, NBC. But now it's called Chemical, Biological, Radiological, and Nuclear Defense Consortium. Hello? They are ordering products as though this is a chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear effort that they are fighting. In other words, a war that has been waged on America with chemical, biological, radiological, or nuclear type products. Okay? And it is with Advanced Technology International. She just got through talking about that. The Joint Project Manager for Medical Countermeasure Systems. Again, that's another key word that you'll find throughout all these contracts. Prototype, medical countermeasure, etc. Notice it doesn't say vaccine, because see, vaccine comes with certain laws that dictate what has to happen when you create or buy a vaccine, even the government, right? Through the Joint Program Executive Office for Chemical and Biological Defense. Again, we are buying something, we are creating something, a prototype to fight biological defense in this case, right? A virus. So, the Joint Program Executive Office for Chemical and Biological Defense seeks to collaborate with the MCDC to carry out a coordinated research and development program. An OTA, other transactional agreement, is being proposed with, here's the purpose of conducting research and development in medical, pharmaceutical, and diagnostic technologies with the purpose of, to enhance mission effectiveness of military personnel. Hello, folks. This, again, I've said this for 3 years now, this is a bioweapon. That is how the Department of Defense is attacking COVID, as a biological weapon. They are ordering prototypes as if America had been attacked with a biological weapon. The MCDC was formed in response to the government's expressed interest to engage with an industry consortium, so a lot of different manufacturers, comprised of traditional and non-traditional government contractors. That's why they're using ATI, because they already had government contracts with manufacturers of different pharmaceutical products. Small and large businesses, for-profit and not-for-profit entities, academic organizations, well, there's your universities, and their affiliates, for the purpose of entering into OTA for, there's the word again, prototype projects. They are not ordering vaccines, folks. They're ordering prototype projects. They're ordering medical countermeasures. And from a legal standpoint, as to what these manufacturers have to create, it falls under the guise of other transactional agreements which, as she already stated earlier, cannot include clinical investigations, good manufacturing practices, etc. I'll explain that again in just a second. Under this agreement and associated awards, the government, along with the non-government members of the MCDC, shall perform coordinated planning and research development prototype efforts designed to encompass the areas contained within the scope of the other transactional agreement as listed in Article 1, Section C. Here's why this is so important. A pharmaceutical product in the United States, as it is in almost any nation in the world, is governed by specific laws to protect the citizens of those nations from getting poorly designed, poorly manufactured, poorly distributed products, right? So pharmaceutical products, by calling them pharmaceutical products, would then fall under those laws and regulations that govern good manufacturing practices, which also include clinical investigations and the trials, right? But they are not, the Army is not contracting to get a pharmaceutical product. What they are getting are prototypes, countermeasures, manufacturing capacity demos, as we just saw. That's what those contracts say. Are you able to produce X amount of this product, this liquid, this chemical, or whatever? That's what they're getting hired to do. And they are not purchasing pharmaceutical products.
So in conclusion, what I would like to say is that all of this points to the fact that COVID-19 injections are not pharmaceuticals, they're indeed weapons. They're biological weapons. And weapons intend to harm. So we see that this is entirely produced by the Department of Defense with collaboration with HHS, who's performing the informational role and propaganda role. And DoD contracts are other transaction authority for vaguely defined things that DoD needs and prototypes and demonstrations. And they're in fact very tightly managed by the DoD, and they specifically list this product as civil and military application. They have coverage through the PrEP Act, which was addressed already. And for the foreign contracts outside of the US, they waive any relevant drug importation rules, again, good manufacturing practices, and prohibit testing of the vials on importation. So that's what I wanted to say today. And if you have any questions.
Sasha, thank you so much. So with that, let me invite Dr. Ness to join us. And Meryl, the DoD and bioterrorism and the intersection with vaccines is something you've talked and worked on for many, many decades. So we'd love to hear your response.
First of all, I want to say that this is a most amazing, extraordinary series of bits of information that are, just unbelievable. The government has, an army of lawyers in all the agencies, and they know how to get around or use the law to the advantage of the agency. But this manner of bypassing normal jurisprudence to get certain things done must have required years of work and combing through documents to figure out how to use these agencies in ways that they have not been used before, and to confuse to confuse the public, but also to confuse the employees of the agencies, so that the agencies think they are doing some sort of regulatory role for an emergency when they're just causing problems. So I guess I'll also say that in my work looking at what DoD does with medicine, I think that DoD has always been looking for a gray area between experimental products and investigational substances, which have their own body of law, and licensed medical products, which also have their own body of law. And both of those sets of laws are quite restrictive. And DoD has been trying to find or taking control of an area that it calls a gray area where none of that law applies. But I don't think a smart federal judge is going to go along with that. So I just feel we have to get a group together to pick through these documents and figure out where we go and mount an important case. So thank you.
So what was the earliest sort of relevant piece of law that you can trace that was changed in particular for this pandemic to occur?
I think the earliest one was the 1983 establishment of the Public Health Emergencies Program under the rubric of the Public Health Services Act, which was a 1944 law. But when Reagan and the Congress at the time put in the Public Health Emergencies section, that was the beginning of sort of concentrating much more power in the hands of the Health and Human Services Secretary whenever a public health emergency has been declared by the HHS Secretary. So it's a completely closed loop of once they declare it, they have all the power, and they are the only one who can suspend their power because of the way they wrote the laws. To the extent, I'll say, to the extent that federal judges and Congress accept the premise that the executive branch can shut them out of everything after the announcement has been made.
So this sort of, unconstitutional, I would say, law was put in place in the 80s.
Yep.
Saying that this branch of government can usurp power pretty much at their own discretion. So what is public health emergency? And how, does it have to have some sort of concrete set of rules, data, any threshold that needs to be reached for a public health emergency to be declared? Or is it just something that they describe as one?
So far, I think it's just one that they describe as one. There may have been, at the beginning, no, it just said public health emergencies is a thing. It's basically like a parallel version of a national emergency. So if they declare a national emergency because of like a war or because of a natural disaster, that has all these cascade effects on other laws and other constitutional rights. And this just added another version of that to be public health emergencies as part of medicalizing it. And I think probably as part of making it harder for people to see that it was a government usurpation or a government tyranny effort, because people think, oh, it's about public health, it's about protecting us. So, yeah.
Yeah, so this, it's now looking at this in retrospect, and of course, I'm familiar with your writing in this particular piece. That's why I'm spending so much time on this particular question. It's because at least in a national emergency, you can say, well, you can point to something concrete: a big earthquake, a big hurricane, maybe somebody did attack us and a bomb exploded. You can point to concrete things. With this, it's more playing on imagination, on fears, on something invisible, an invisible threat that you can't identify, but it's so deadly and so stealthy. So that's how it all kind of ties together with the long history of this.
Yes, and it's way less destructive of infrastructure. Like it can destroy social structures and economic structures without actually taking out like buildings and railroad tracks and factories with bombs. So it's for the people who want to do the takeover, they can keep all of the productive facilities and get rid of the people who might otherwise want a share in the products produced there. Yes, and that piece about before you even have symptoms is super important, because they came up with the term asymptomatic, and they also, I just found the other day in a Health and Human Services regulation, pre-communicable. It's like that's even more than asymptomatic. It's before communicable, and they put that in as like, this is a thing that we're going to try to keep track of, so that if it's even in just the pre-communicable stage, we can still quarantine people.
It's absolutely incredible. So they can quarantine you, so the government can take you away from your family, your children from your family, based on an unidentifiable pathogen of which you are not symptomatic, and you have no ability to transmit it to anyone. So basically, just take you away
for no reason.
For no reason whatsoever.
Yeah.
So that's kind of that's what I want to people to clearly understand. And then so the second question I had is about this other transactional authority, and I think you covered it really well. And I will attach the document that you gave me to this video. But I want people to understand, because not a lot of people are familiar with this at all.
Right. So I came across it because of Brooke Jackson's case. Brooke Jackson is the whistleblower who was working for Ventavia, who was a subcontractor to Pfizer under the contract Pfizer had with the Department of the Defense to produce 100 million doses of what they call a vaccine and distribute it through the DoD to all the people in the United States. And Brooke Jackson, as soon as she got to her trial site in, she had 3 in Texas, she noticed there were terrible problems with the clinical trials. And she reported it first to her bosses at Ventavia, then to people at Pfizer. Then she tried to file, I think, an anonymous hotline report to the FDA, and within hours of the FDA report, she was fired. And then she filed a False Claims Act case because her theory at that time was that Pfizer was defrauding the US government by falsely saying they were doing good clinical trials, and that the US government would want to know this because they would want to not spend money on a fraudulently produced product. And it turned out that that is not the case. The US government was in on the fraudulent clinical trials and in on the whole fraud entirely. And that sort of came out in Pfizer's April 2022 motion to dismiss, because Brooke, when she filed her False Claims Act, she attached the statement of work, which was a contract that was supposed to govern how the clinical trials were done. And in its motion to dismiss, Pfizer attached another contract called an Other Transaction Authority, OTA contract, saying, in effect, no, we had no obligation to conduct valid clinical trials because the only goods and services we were providing to the US government, according to this contract, are a large-scale manufacturing demonstration for a prototype. So they kind of split off the clinical trials from the manufacturing and production side. And so I looked at that contract and had already sort of come to the conclusion that it was a joint fraud between Pfizer and the DoD, and this sort of corroborated that in Pfizer's own words. So the OTA is a separate contracting, purchasing framework that US government agencies can enter into with private companies. And the report that I sent you is from KEI. And the title of it is Other Transaction Agreements, Government Contracts that Eliminate Protections for the Public on Pricing, Access, and Competition, including in connection with COVID-19 vaccines and treatments. And so it started in 1958, according to that report, through NASA, but it's since been expanded to, I think they said 11 agencies have it now, have this special authority that Congress has given them to enter into these contracts. And it suspends all kinds of oversight. That's the bottom line of what an OTA does. And so in my view, Pfizer is probably correct that under the terms of the OTA, they had no obligation to ever conduct a valid clinical trial. They could make the entire thing a fraud. They could make the entire thing seem to be real and submit actual data, but it didn't have to be good data. It didn't have to be in compliance with any of the regulations that otherwise govern clinical trials. And so that's why in the one piece I've done on it, I compared it to the emergency use authorization, because OTA did for the financial contracting side what EUA did to the drug regulation side. They both just took them out of the normal. Yeah.
So this is a structure by which the government can essentially waive for themselves all the normal rules and regulations for development approval of otherwise regulated products, such as pharmaceuticals.
Right.
And order that thing that now has no regulations attached to it.
Right.
From the private manufacturer who is otherwise would be regulated by those rules.
Yes.
So that's again, that needs to be understood very clearly. So, and when you said, they order prototypes, is prototype defined? What is prototype?
Prototype is I think it's one of the keywords that makes it clearer that it's a bioweapon and not a drug. Well, it's a drug that is a bioweapon, basically. But prototype just has to do with it's I don't even know how to explain it. It's a product that doesn't have like other regulatory meanings. It's yeah, I should look into that more, but like where in the statutes prototype is defined. But what it boils down to is it's a military product as part of a military project. It's not a pharmaceutical project as part of a public health project.
Yeah. So yeah, I've been talking a lot about the fact that the DoD ordered all these prototypes and all these countermeasures,
and that they control it from the very beginning of the. I think you talked about that yeah. So that's why a lot of people ask me, what is the proof that DoD controls it? How would you answer that question? What does need to exist to show people the proof? Well, other than the documents that we're all pointing out to, but like really, how do they control this whole production? I mean, I think they control it because they control there's the things that you pointed out in the contract about the DoD has to be a participant on every single phone call, every single email, every single meeting that happens between Pfizer or its subcontractors or any of the pharmaceutical subcontractors and the FDA regulators, which means that DoD is in there directly controlling the decisions that FDA makes and the announcements that FDA makes and the material that FDA is allowed to review or not review. And that plays into another piece of the puzzle that that showed up through Brooke Jackson's case, which is under the law, the HHS secretary is supposed to make his or her decisions about EUA products, about medical countermeasures, about security countermeasures, all these terms they came up with, which basically just mean bioweapons, but bioweapons packaged so that they look like medicine. They're supposed to make it on the basis of scientific data and evidence, comma, if available. And that if available is very, very important because the DoD was in a position to make sure that no valid data would ever be made available to the FDA regulators, and to ensure that even without it, they would produce the authorizations and the approvals that the DoD required under the terms of the contract with Pfizer in order to go ahead with the manufacturing and the contracts and the hundreds of millions of dollars that they funneled to these companies. So the availability of data is a key part of how DoD controls not just the product itself, but also the information available to the regulators and to the HHS secretary. I don't think that gets them off the hook morally, because I think that the FDA and HHS officials were willing and knowing participants in it, and I think that can be shown. But it does explain the mechanism by which it was done.
So yeah, so that we need to spend a little more time on this. So the decision to what is it legally called? Is it authorization, licensing, or is it just deployment of the countermeasures? Is up to the sole authority of HHS secretary, who under Trump was Alex Azar, and now it's Javier Becerra. So
Yes.
those two individuals, sequentially made decisions about deployment of these countermeasures, prototypes, bioweapons onto American public and the world.
Yes.
And that decision was based on available data, if available.
Yes. It was based on available data about the products, and it was also based on available data about the known and potential risks of the actual thing that they were deploying the product against. So they got to decide unilaterally, basically as dictators, what is the level of threat that this SARS-CoV-2 poses to the population, and what are the acceptable risks and benefits calculations of the countermeasure deployed against that first SARS-CoV-2 thing. So it's like it is multi-layered.
So yeah, the enormity of this, I can't emphasize enough. Is one person, Alex Azar or Javier Becerra, decides for 300 million people in the United States unilaterally how much threat COVID poses to them today and in the future. And how safe and efficacious this product is for them, specifically individual, and for their children, their babies, their elderly, their now and in the future.
Yes.
So how insane that is just, just blows my mind. But it is written in the US law.
Right. It's massive, and it's very hard to wrap your head around how massive it is.
Yeah. And I will put citations that Catherine provided under this video as well, so that people can check for themselves and read that language that we just cited. So another question I had, before we go into the information management of this, so let's say, Alex, let's play back the scenario. Alex Azar is HHS. This thing starts unfolding. They're claiming it's, super lethal, next plague. Okay, so he decides, somebody shoves these things in front of him and says they're okay. Pfizer said so, FDA said so, DoD says so. He thinks, okay, they may be effective, and so let's deploy them.
Yeah.
But that's let's say early 2020. Now, 2 years later, we have 2 years worth of data on both the local transmission of COVID, which is near zero everywhere. The
effective other treatments is another thing.
Other treatments. The deadliness of the injections, there's a lot of adverse events in it. Now they're even admitting officially myocarditis is a thing. A bunch of states said that, such as Florida, we're not going to recommend it to children. Is this the available information that now Javier Becerra has to take into account? Or is it just, he can pretend he never heard these things?
I think he can pretend he never heard these things. He could definitely pretend he never heard these things, because he's been pretending that for 2 years now. There is no, and that's where it gets into the amazing structural features Congress built into these things, where Congress not only put all the power into the HHS secretary's hands, they also eliminated their own oversight power. They eliminated, or they claim to, this is written in the laws, they claim that they have no power to overrule or like review his emergency declarations about their existing an emergency. They can't overrule his EUA declarations. They also put provisions that no federal judge can review those declarations. Once they're made, they're considered solely within agency discretion. So there's no judicial review, and eliminated states' power to take any course of action different from what the HHS secretary has said that they should do, which is called preemption. There's sections in these laws. I have it in my head, but I can't think of the name of it. That just make it so that there is no state authority to overrule HHS secretary. There is no congressional authority to overrule HHS secretary, and there is no judicial authority. And Congress did that, which raises the super interesting philosophical question of, with horrible implications, like how did they give away a power that they didn't have the power to give away? Like Congress does not have the power to dissolve itself. Congress does not have the power to dissolve the federal judiciary under the US Constitution, but they did it to the extent that the federal judges are deferring to them, and Congress is deferring to the HHS secretary, and the states, for the most part, with exceptions like Florida, are deferring and not challenging these things. They're just saying, whoop, that happened.
I guess we'll, you gave our power away.
I guess the Constitution's gone now, so whatever.
So we'll just continue collecting pensions and have a nice life, and hope it will blow over, right?
I don't know if they hope it'll blow over. I think they're planning to make it more of them doing less and more of, because I think their goal is to like turn it all over to the World Health Organization and left and stuff. So that's the game that they're playing. Yeah. But if they never had, you can't give away a power that wasn't yours to give away to begin with. And the power in our country is supposed to be in the Constitution, the supreme law of the land. There's supposed to be nobody that's above it. So to have Congress say, well, never mind, is just super bizarre.
It's absolutely incredible. And I hope more people see this and understand what's happened.